How to live peacefully amidst challenges. Have you ever sat in a quiet room, yet still felt like something inside you was screaming? You scroll through your phone, surrounded by pictures of perfect lives. You go to work, you check the boxes, you succeed, at least, that's what everyone says. But deep down, there's this strange emptiness, a silent ache, a sense that no matter how much you achieve, something is still missing. We live in a world where comfort is abundant, and yet peace is rare. We have everything at our fingertips: food, shelter, information, even followers. But the one thing we can't seem to hold on to is peace of mind. Why? Why, in a time of luxury, are we drowning in anxiety? Why, when surrounded by people, do we still feel so alone? Why, when everything looks okay on the outside, do we feel so broken within? This is not just your story. This is the story of our time. Behind closed doors, even the most successful people are quietly suffering, not from poverty, not from war, but from restlessness, from meaninglessness, from a spiritual thirst no material thing can quench. And so we chase, harder, faster, louder, believing that peace lies in the next promotion, the next vacation, the next relationship, the next version of ourselves. But what if we've been looking in the wrong direction? What if peace doesn't come after the storm? What if it's something we learn to carry within the storm? Buddhism doesn't promise a life without problems, it doesn't promise a path without suffering, but it offers something far more powerful. It teaches us how to walk through life's fires without being burned. As the Buddha once said, no one saves us but ourselves. No one can and no one may. We ourselves must walk the path. So the question is no longer how do I avoid challenges? It becomes, how do I remain peaceful in the heart of chaos? And that is the journey we begin right now. In this video, we'll explore Buddhist wisdom, not as philosophy, but as a living guide. We'll learn how to anchor ourselves when life gets turbulent, how to soften instead of shatter, and how to discover a peace so deep, it no longer depends on the world around us. So take a deep breath. This isn't just a lesson, this is an invitation to return to the stillness that's always been there inside you. Let us begin. We often treat suffering like an enemy, as if pain were a mistake, as if hardship were some kind of punishment, as if sadness meant we were doing life wrong. But what if suffering isn't the enemy? What if it's actually the first doorway to wisdom? The Buddha's path, the one we all admire, didn't begin with enlightenment, it began with suffering. He was a prince, sheltered, safe, surrounded by luxury, and yet his heart was unsettled. One day, he stepped beyond the palace walls, and saw what he had been protected from his whole life: old age, illness, death, and sorrow. That moment changed everything, because for the first time, he saw the truth of human existence. That no one escapes suffering, not kings, not beggars, not even the wise, and that truth became the first noble truth, dukkha, the truth of suffering. But listen carefully, Buddhism doesn't stop at saying life is suffering. It says, yes, suffering exists, but it can be understood, it can be transformed. You see, we're not being punished by life, we're being awakened by it. Pain isn't cruelty, it's a messenger. It shows up when we're clinging too tightly, when we've placed our happiness in something unstable, a job, a relationship, an identity, an expectation, and when those things inevitably change, we feel pain. But the pain isn't the problem, our attachment to how things should be. That's where the suffering begins. Let me tell you a story. There was once a young monk who came to his master, tears in his eyes. My heart is broken, he said. Everything I loved has been taken from me. The master looked at him gently and said, good. Now your real training can begin. Because only when we break, can we see what's underneath all the layers. Only when we're empty, can we be filled with something deeper than the world can offer. This is the radical compassion of Buddhist wisdom. It doesn't ask you to deny your pain, it asks you to turn toward it, to learn from it. The lotus, after all, does not bloom in clear water, it blossoms in mud, and perhaps that's the greatest secret. Suffering isn't here to destroy you, it's here to wake you up. So instead of asking, why is this happening to me? What if we asked, what is this here to teach me? Have you ever noticed how two people can go through the same situation, but respond completely differently? One person loses their job and falls into despair, another loses theirs and sees it as a new beginning. One person feels rejected and worthless, another feels the same pain, but sees it as a chance to grow stronger. The same world, the same event, but a different mind, creates a different experience. That's the secret. It's not the world that creates the storm, it's the mind. We think suffering comes from outside, from rude people, unfair bosses, traffic, money, politics. But the truth is, the storm usually brews inside us, long before it ever shows up outside. As the Buddha taught, we are shaped by our thoughts, we become what we think. When the mind is pure, joy follows like a shadow that never leaves. So let me ask you, how do you talk to yourself in difficult moments? When something goes wrong, do you instantly blame yourself? When someone hurts you, do you replay it 100 times in your head? When you're uncertain, do you spiral into fear, imagining the worst? These are the mental habits that feed the storm, and until we learn to understand them, we will always live in reaction, never in freedom. You see, our mind is like a garden. Whatever we plant, grows. If we plant seeds of fear, anger, and judgment, we harvest suffering. But if we plant awareness, if we pause, observe, breathe, we start to interrupt the old cycle. Let me share a simple story. A layman once asked a Buddhist master, "Master, how can I stop the storms in my life?" The master smiled and replied, "You don't stop the storm. You stop holding your umbrella upside down." What did he mean? He meant, the rain is just rain. The problem isn't the rain, it's how we meet it. It's our resistance, our inner commentary, our refusal to allow what is. The moment we say, "This shouldn't be happening. This is unfair. This is not what I expected," that's when the mind begins to twist, and the twisting creates the thunder. But when we pause, when we truly see what the mind is doing, without judgment, we become free, free not from life, but free within it. So the practice is not to fight the world, it's to understand the one who's experiencing it, to become friends with our thoughts, to watch them, without becoming them. As the clouds pass, so too will emotions, so too will anger, doubt, fear. They are weather, but you are the sky, and in the vastness of that sky, no storm lasts forever. What if I told you that peace doesn't begin with changing your life, but simply with a pause, just a breath, just a moment of stopping, right where you are? We live in a world addicted to speed, rushing from one task to the next, one scroll to the next, one thought to another, without ever touching the present. We're always going somewhere, but how often are we actually here? And this is where suffering silently multiplies, not in the hardship itself, but in the way we never allow ourselves to fully feel, to fully stop, to fully be. But Buddhism teaches us a quiet miracle, that when we pause, we make space, and in that space, healing begins. As Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh once said, "Feelings come and go like clouds in a windy sky. Conscious breathing is my anchor, just breathing, consciously, kindly, with full presence. This is mindfulness, not a technique. Not an escape, but a return to the life that's already here." Let me tell you a story. There was once a young man who came to a monastery to escape the chaos of his life. He asked the old monk, "What is the first step to peace?" The monk smiled and said, "When you eat, just eat. When you walk, just walk. When you sit, just sit. Do not let your mind be ahead of your body." The young man frowned. "That's all." The monk replied, "It is simple, but not easy, because the mind is a restless traveler, always chasing or resisting. But mindfulness gently calls it home, again and again. When we pause, we begin to see that not every thought must be believed, that not every emotion must be obeyed, that silence isn't empty, it's full of knowing. Think about this. When someone insults us, what's our first instinct? React, defend, fire back. But in mindfulness, there's a sacred gap, a pause, and in that pause, we ask, is this worth my peace? What's truly happening inside me? Can I choose presence instead of reaction? That pause, just a few seconds, is the birthplace of compassion. It's where anger softens, where understanding grows, where we begin to respond, not just react. In Buddhism, this pause is called samatha, calming the mind. It's the stillness before insight, like letting muddy water sit until it clears. And here's the beauty: you don't need to go to the mountains to pause, you don't need hours of silence, you just need one breath, fully lived, right now. Feel the air entering your nose, feel it leave, slowly, feel the rise and fall of your chest. This moment is your teacher. The pause teaches us to come home, not just to our breath, but to our life. Can you stay present, even when the present hurts? Can you stay with your breath, when your heart feels like it's breaking? It's easy to be mindful when life is calm, when the tea is warm, the sun is shining, and all is well. But what about when life shatters? What about when the phone call comes with news you never wanted to hear? When a relationship ends? When you're alone in a crowd, and no one sees your pain? What do we do then? This is where real practice begins. You see, Buddhism doesn't promise that life will be painless, but it does promise something deeper, that peace is possible, even when pain is present, because pain is natural, but suffering is often optional. We suffer when we resist what is, when we wish things were different, when we say, this shouldn't be happening. This isn't fair. This is not how life was supposed to go. But here's the truth: life isn't supposed to go a certain way, life just goes, and our job is to meet it fully. Thich Nhat Hanh once said, the present moment is filled with joy and happiness. If you are attentive, you will see it. But he also said, when we suffer, it is because we are caught in our suffering. We must learn to cradle it with compassion. To cradle our pain, like a mother holds a crying child, not push it away, not deny it, just hold it, with presence, with tenderness. Because here's something most people don't realize: even grief contains beauty, even sorrow contains aliveness, even tears carry wisdom. The poet Rumi once wrote, the wound is the place where the light enters you. That's not just poetry. That's Dharma. Let me share a story. There was a woman who lost her only child. In her devastation, she ran to the Buddha and begged him to bring her child back. The Buddha gently told her, I will help you. But first, bring me a mustard seed from a house that has never known sorrow. She went door to door, but every home had its own grief: a lost parent, a sick child, a broken marriage. She returned, tears streaming down her face, and bowed deeply. She understood. Sorrow is part of the human experience. No one escapes it, but we can suffer together, and heal together. This is the heart of living in the present, even when it hurts. It's not about fixing the moment, it's about being with it, feeling the sharpness of grief, without running, tasting the salt of your tears, without shame, and slowly, the pain changes, it softens, it teaches, it opens you to a deeper compassion, not just for yourself, but for everyone who has ever suffered. You begin to see strangers with softer eyes, because now you know, they too carry hidden griefs. To live fully in the present, even when it hurts, is to become deeply human, and deeply awake, because real peace is not the absence of pain, it's the presence of wisdom, in the middle of it. There are moments in life, when no words are enough, no sentence can ease the pain, no advice can fix what's broken, no explanation can make sense of the loss, and yet, there is something more powerful than words, something quieter, but infinitely more healing: your presence. Not what you say, not what you do, just you, fully here. Have you ever sat beside someone who was grieving, and felt utterly helpless? You wanted to say something meaningful, but everything sounded hollow, so instead, you just stayed. Maybe you held their hand, or breathed beside them, or simply let the silence speak. That is compassion, that is healing, that is what Buddhism calls true presence. You see, we live in a culture that glorifies doing, fixing, advising, solving, but in moments of deep suffering, people don't need fixing, they need to be seen, they need to be felt, they need to be held, without judgment, without agenda, the Buddha taught this with the same stillness he embodied. He didn't rush to mend every wound with words. Sometimes, he simply sat in silence, fully awake, fully present, like a mountain in a storm, and that presence moved hearts more than 1,000 sermons. Let me tell you a story. There was a young woman who had just lost her father. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't stop crying. Her heart was shattered. Her friends tried to help. One said, "At least he lived a long life." Another said, "You have to be strong now." Another, "Everything happens for a reason." But none of it helped. It only made her feel more alone. Then, one evening, her grandmother came. She didn't say a word. She just sat beside her, held her gently, rocked her like a child. No words, no answers, just love, and in that stillness, the girl finally wept. Not from despair, but from the feeling of being seen. Sometimes, that's all we need, to know we're not alone. In Buddhism, we call this karu, the compassion that doesn't need to explain or fix. It simply is. It's the energy of presence. It listens with the whole body. It breathes with the one who suffers. You become like a candle, not telling the darkness what to do, but gently shining until the room feels less cold. This is the medicine most needed in our world, not louder opinions, not better arguments, but quieter hearts, more present souls. So the next time someone you love is in pain, don't rush to speak. Pause, breathe, stay. Let your eyes say, "I'm here." Let your silence say, "You don't have to go through this alone." Because sometimes, the deepest healing comes when nothing is said, and everything is felt. We've journeyed together through the storm, through the chaos of the world outside and the turmoil within. We've learned that life isn't about avoiding the challenges. It's not about running away from pain. It's not about controlling the winds of change. It's about finding your center, and standing firm, even when the winds are howling. Because here's the truth, my friends, peace is not about escaping life's difficulties. It's not about reaching some far-off place of tranquility, where everything is perfect, and nothing ever goes wrong. That's a fantasy. True peace is not an escape, it's an embodiment. It's the ability to be fully present in each moment, to be with what is. Without resistance, without judgment, and without the need to change it. The Buddha once said, "Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without." In other words, peace is not something you find on the outside, it's something you cultivate, moment by moment, from the inside. It's in the way you breathe when the world feels too heavy. It's in the way you respond, not react, when life shakes you. It's in the stillness you can hold, even in the midst of a storm. You see, you don't have to escape life's challenges. You don't need to find a perfect situation, a perfect world. The world will never be perfect, but you can be. In every challenge, there is an opportunity to return to your center, and in every storm, there's a chance to stand still, to breathe deeply, and to remember who you truly are. Because peace is not a place you go to, it's a way of being, a way of living, a way of loving, a way of being in the world, without getting swept away by it. It's the way you sit with your pain, without identifying with it, the way you live with your joy, without clinging to it, the way you respond to others, without judgment, without expectation. That is peace, and that peace is available to you, right now, no matter what your life looks like, no matter how loud the world is. No matter how big the storm you're facing, you can return to your center, you can choose peace, in every moment. As we close today's journey together, I want you to take a deep breath. And remember, you are already whole, you are already enough. The storm will come and go, but you are the sky, you are the stillness behind it all. Now, before you go, if this video has touched you, if you found something here that resonates deeply, please like, share, and subscribe to the Zen Buddhism Wisdom channel. We're on this journey together, and there's always more to explore. If you've experienced a moment of peace today, share it with us in the comments below. What does peace mean to you? How do you stay centered in life's storms? Let's keep the conversation going, and continue growing together in wisdom and peace. Thank you for being here. Until next time. Stay present, stay grounded, and stay at peace.